Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 641 of the People Behind the Science podcast. In this episode, we are revisiting our conversation with Dr. Laurie Santos, originally published on May 9th of 2016. Listeners, Laurie is an accomplished cognitive scientist and an avid science communicator. Her work has provided fascinating insights into the evolutionary origins of the human mind and what makes human cognition unique compared to other animals. And Laurie shared some excellent stories about her life and her research in our interview. So get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you all to Dr. Laurie Santos. So, Laurie, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm great, thanks.
Wonderful. We are excited to welcome you to the show. And I want to give our listeners just a little bit of background before we dive into our questions here. So, listeners, Laurie is a professor of psychology and director of the Comparative Cognition Laboratory at Yale University. She received her bachelor's in psychology and biology from Harvard and Radcliffe College, and she went on to complete her master's and Ph.D. in psychology from Harvard University. Among Laurie's many awards and honors, she has received the American Psychological Association's Distinguished Scientific Award for early career contributions to psychology, as well as the Lex Hixton Prize for teaching excellence in the social sciences, the Arthur Greer Memorial Prize for outstanding junior faculty at Yale, the Stanton Prize from the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, and she has also been named one of Time Magazine's leading campus celebrities. Now, Laurie and her research have been featured by The Today Show, BBC News, NPR News, NBC News, The New York Times, and many other media outlets. And she is here with us today, listeners, to talk about her journey through life and science. So, Laurie, we want to get to know you both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by giving us a window into your life outside of science and how you spend your time?
Well, my outside of science life is not that much in the sense that I'm spending a lot of my time doing science and I'm kind of a huge science nerd. But in terms of some of the stuff I like to do when I'm not doing science, I'm super into finding not very aggressive hikes to kind of just hang out in nature as much as possible. I like reading very cheesy celebrity autobiographies, like kind of tell-all memoirs.
Really?
And I'm very bad at, but really enjoy doing karaoke and sing-alongs. So 3 tidbits of strange ways I like to spend my time outside of science.
That is awesome. So do you have a signature karaoke piece you like to do?
I kind of like all of them. I like doing a lot of like Justin Timberlake and some Beyonce. I've been known to do a Mean Under Pressure as well, but a little bit of everything.
Amazing. So do you have the dance moves to go along with the Justin and Beyonce songs?
No.
Well, fantastic to hear more about your life outside of science. I think it is important for people to realize that though we're spending a lot of time in the lab, as scientists, we do have lives outside of the lab most of the time.
Most of the time, yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit now about your lab life and maybe a high-level description of how you describe what you do in your daily life as a scientist?
I am a psychologist by training, but I spend most of my time not studying humans, which is what most psychologists do. I spend a lot of time studying other animals. And broadly, I'm just interested in this question of what makes humans special. Why are we the only species that has science and podcasts and technology and all the crazy stuff that we as humans have when no other species does? And I'm particularly interested in the kinds of cognitive abilities that make humans special, the strategies and the decisions that we have that really make up who we are. And so I study that by trying to see if any non-human animals share the kinds of abilities that humans have. For most of my career, I've focused on studying non-human primates, our closest living relatives. I've done lots of work trying to see if monkeys share some of our social abilities, some of our economic decision-making abilities. But most recently, I've sort of extended that research to non-primate species. We've just started Yale's first Canine Cognition Center to start studying cognition in some of man's best friends.
I think that's so cool.
Yeah. And the reason there is that even though dogs aren't as closely related to us as, say, apes, they live in really the same environments. And so they can provide this really fantastic window into studying what we as humans get uniquely from our kind of very strange upbringing versus what we get through our phylogeny and so on.
Well, Laurie, I cannot wait to talk more about your research and some of the projects you have going on, but I want to talk a little bit about what motivates you first. I think, as you described, you spend a lot of your life doing science. There's a lot of work to do, but is there a particular motivational quote or a saying or something in your life that keeps you motivated to keep going in every day to do all this hard work?
Not necessarily a particular one, but I'll give you one that I like to use when things aren't going so well. It comes from a Gide quote that goes, "In gratitude, transform all that comes to you into happiness." And I think in science and in everyday life, we're kind of constantly faced with this challenge of turning the kinds of things we get into the kinds of things we should appreciate. So it's kind of a quote that kind of keeps me going when things aren't going so well in life or in science.
Definitely helps you put things in perspective too, maybe.
For sure.
I like it. Well, now, can you tell us a little bit about some of the people who may have come across your path in your journey as a scientist who maybe served as role models, or if you had a scientific hero that you looked up to?
Yeah, I've had some pretty fantastic science role models, particularly kind of being a woman in science. The field of psychology is filled with these fantastic female mentors, people like the psychologist Liz Spelke at Harvard, Susan Carey at Harvard. So I was very, very lucky to have these big figures in the field who I could look up to. But if I had to pick one scholar who I think most impressed me and kind of got me on the path to my career as a scientist, I'd pick a neuroscientist at MIT by the name of Nancy Kamisher. I was lucky enough as an undergraduate at Harvard to take a class with Nancy. She taught a cognitive psychology class, and it was a great class, but it was particularly impressive to me in part because Nancy was just really young and just super cool. She would do all these kind of cool demos with funky new neuroscientific techniques. And I think I just had such a academic crush on her that the idea of following in her path and becoming a cognitive psychologist myself was just so appealing. And it's still tragic for me to realize now that no matter how cool my students think I am, I will never be as cool as Nancy Kamisher.
Really? So have you tried to incorporate some of these dynamic elements into your lectures to maybe inspire people?
One of the things I loved about Nancy is she would do all these elaborate demos, and as is the case in psychology, sometimes they would almost never work. They'd kind of always crashing down.
Sure.
So I get a little bit of a badge of pride whenever I try one in my own class and it kind of doesn't go as well. I'm hopefully trying to be as smooth as Nancy was.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome to hear about one of these people who really inspired you. And I think it is so helpful when you're in a field where there are these role models you can look up to. And as a woman scientist, as you mentioned, it's kind of hard to find those sometimes. So was it hard for you to initiate this relationship with some of these people you mentioned at Harvard, for example? And do you have any advice for people who might be seeking a mentor out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think in psychology, particularly in terms of women in science, it's been relatively easy just because there's real representation of those people out there. I mean, I guess my advice would just be that if you're interested in a topic, do reach out to the people who are studying it, in part because they're just as interested in it and just as kind of nerding out about it as you are, right? So I've always found that when you have students who come up to you who share a genuine interest, I'm just as excited to kind of mentor them as they are to be mentored by me. So really don't feel like you're kind of putting a burden on faculty members. People really want to hear what you're excited about, particularly if you're excited about the same stuff that they are.
Well, that is excellent advice for our listeners. I'm curious to hear about when this interest of yours in cognition and psychology began. So, Laurie, can you take us all the way back to the beginning, wherever that may be, and tell us what first sparked your interest in science?
Yeah. So I was always sort of interested in humans and human behavior and stuff. I think it really got started for me in terms of taking psychology classes at the college level, really starting off as a freshman in intro psych and sort of realizing wait, this is not just a topic that's super interesting. This is a field that we can study and we can answer questions and we can make some progress in it. And so classes like Nancy's, another class by another neuroscientist, Steve Koslin, was really formative. But it was around the time that I took a class really on this question of comparative cognitions or comparing cognition in humans and animals that I really just got hooked. And the professor who was teaching the class at the time had research opportunities where you could go to field sites and study animals, where you could really work with macaques in a wild setting. And so it's basically, I got the opportunity to do exactly the kind of science that I do today really early on. And since then, it just kind of stuck. Being at the field site and seeing the animal, particularly the monkeys who are so similar to us, yet so different, and kind of watching them up close just gave me this whole set of questions that I'm still super interested in today. So for me, it happened really early on, being exposed to scientists who were doing this stuff and realizing, hey, this is a field that one can really study and dive into.
Oh, that's so cool. So did you kind of always know that you wanted to follow this academic faculty pathway, or were there other things that you considered along your journey?
Definitely was in and out. I think if you're a kind of smart, curious person, you're often feeling some sort of existential crisis about what you're doing, because studying monkeys on tropical islands is cool, but so is being an astronaut, and so is being a poet, and so is being a waitress in France somewhere or something. So I think you constantly, or at least I have constantly kind of doubted whether or not this was the right thing to do. At various points, I had thought about leaving a more academic setting to be more like a science journalist. That was the closest other path I considered. Definitely there were times of running away forever and doing something totally different too. But I was kind of lucky to both have mentors who kind of made it seem like this was a path that was possible for me and made it seem like this was a path that was fun and doable. And so I stuck to a pretty strict academic path for most of it.
Certainly. And I'm really glad you brought up these sort of feelings of doubt. I have these every day. I get these grant rejections. I'm like, what am I doing with my life?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's totally normal.
My students think like when I talk to undergrads about their career path and they say like, well, when do you know for sure? And I'm like, I still don't know for sure.
Right. So can you tell us then what took you from this curious, excited about psychology kind of student to where you are today? What are some of these key moments that helped you follow this career path?
For me, the key moments don't feel as much like big decisions where I decided to do this path. A lot for me was sort of happenstance and luck to a certain extent. I happened to be at a university that had opportunities to study in comparative cognition, which is the kind of thing I do today. I happened to be in the right place at the right time for getting an academic position here at Yale. I think they were kind of looking for somebody doing comparative cognition, and it's a small field. So it was just the right timing where I was able to come to a place that had the sorts of resources that I needed to do it. So for me, when I look back, it feels less like pivotal moments and more like a lot of happenstance that could have gone very different ways. And I'd be in a totally different place than I am now.
That's really interesting. And I know a couple of people have said that on our program. So I think that's also reassuring for students out there. Like, you don't need to have this grand plan with every step worked out in advance. You kind of just have to let it happen.
Yeah. And I think that advice can also be scary. I've had students say, well, then how can I plan it? How can I take exactly the right courses? And particularly today with the current generation, I think finding space to try stuff out and finding room for happenstance ends up being more important than students often think. So I like hearing tales of scientists who wound up where they were via happenstance, because not everything has to be perfectly planned out. And sometimes when things feel like they're going off course, they're really on the course that's right for you anyway.
Certainly. Well, now you are at Yale and you are working on some fantastic research. So Laurie, I want you to tell us a little bit more detail about one of these things going on in the lab that you are just the most excited about.
Well, one is a bit different than the stuff that I started on. Just this semester, we started on a new project on a completely different taxonomic group for our lab, which is fish, which sounds a little bit strange. But we've been focused on this cool species known as cleaner fish, which are reef-living fish who actually do the work of cleaning the bacteria off of other fish. So they're kind of like the fish dentist or sort of the fish janitor or something.
Sure.
But the cool thing about this species is that they set up these really cool cooperative mutualisms with other fish. So they get to cooperate by cleaning the bacteria, but they also have the potential for cheating, where they sometimes want to take a bite out of the fish that they're cleaning, but they're not supposed to. And it turns out that this system is a really cool model for studying the kinds of cooperative problems that humans face, right? Do you cooperate or do you defect? If you're working with a partner and that partner defects, do you punish him? And so on. And we were able, in collaboration with Redwan Bashari, who's a professor who's studied this system for a long time, and my students, Katie McAuliffe and Lindsay Drayton, we set up a project to try to study what the cleaner fish are really thinking about when they're engaging in these cooperative behaviors. Are they kind of tracking what the other guys in their species and in their team are thinking? Are they kind of tracking what other individuals have seen in their reputation over time? And so we were able to do this project at a new field site in French Polynesia. So I got to head to French Polynesia for a month to kind of study the fish. And it was awesome because I got to feel like a grad student again. I'm learning all this stuff for the first time. I really get to see tiny details of how you do fish studies versus how you do monkey studies. And it was just an absolute blast.
Well, this is really cool. And I know most of us can kind of wrap our heads around the idea of monkeys thinking or dogs thinking, because you can sort of see what it looks like. What does thinking look like for a fish, and how do you study it?
So what we did was to set up little experimental versions of the kinds of problems that these fish face in their natural life. And the great thing about this system is instead of giving the fish another fish to clean, you could give them a little plate and sort of convince them that this little plexiglass plate was another fish. And so that meant that we could set up our own little interactions, give the fish different numbers of temptations, and basically just see what they did, both in terms of their behavior. Did they cooperate or did they cheat? But also in terms of their partner's reactions. Did their partner punish them depending on what they did? So we could really set these studies up, not with the fish in the wild, kind of watching their natural behavior, but give them this experimental situation and see what they did.
That is really interesting. Well, Laurie, it sounds like you have had a lot of different research opportunities. I mean, you mentioned working in monkeys, working in dogs, working in fish. Do you have a favorite organism to study?
Oh, that's so hard. The monkeys are always my first love, I think, particularly rhesus monkeys, who I study at a field site in Puerto Rico. I always joke with my students that you stick with the first species that you work with. They're like your baby forever. Mm-hmm. Definitely for me, the rhesus monkeys are that.
Very cool. I understand you just returned from a field site recently. So can you tell us a little bit about that experience? Was this French Polynesia?
This was French Polynesia, yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, it was fantastic, beautiful, and we got a surprising amount of data done. My student, Lindsay, just presented her data at our annual talk series for grad students, and everyone was like, wow, it's such cool new data, and she was super excited. So it was a great trip.
Well, that is awesome. Thank you for sharing more about your current research. But I think thus far we have painted a relatively rosy view of your life as a scientist. And I know it is so exciting to go in and every day be able to answer some of the questions you're most curious about. But there are downsides too. So we would like to make sure we cover those on our program so our listeners kind of have a realistic view of what the life is like as a scientist. So can you share one of these downtimes, a frustration, a challenge, a failure that you faced and how you got through it?
If I had to take kind of the biggest failure of my career so far, it would be a situation that came up a couple of years ago where I was forced to retract a paper, in part because one of the students that I'd worked with on the paper, this was a student I'd worked with for about 8 years at the time, had really messed up pretty badly, kind of in the worst ways you can mess up as a scientist. So without getting into all the gory details of that, just in terms of my struggle as a scientist, this was just awful. I felt like I had failed as an advisor and failed as a scientist and was upset at the student and felt betrayed, and it was just particularly awful. And in thinking of how I got through it, really, in all honesty, I think what got me through it was just time. The adage of time heals all wounds is definitely partly true. I think time and just kind of reflection to get away from the emotion of it ended up meaning a lot. And the lesson I took from it, it made our lab a lot more careful in terms of how we put different safeguards in to make sure no mistakes get into our published studies. It's made me a lot more anal with how I look at data and so on. But really, it was just an icky time that I hope no other scientist who's listening to this ever has to go through. But it's the kind of thing that can happen even if you're trying to do your best work possible.
Well, and I think these paper retractions, it sort of falls in the bucket of the top 3 worst things that you can have to deal with as a scientist, right along with getting denied tenure, things like that. So when you first realized that these mistakes had been in the paper and you were going to have to retract it, what was going through your mind?
It was awful. I was sort of thinking about how our decision would be received. I was thinking about whether we did it in the right way. Oftentimes when these things happen, you have to take a really slow process as university committees look into things and so on. And it was frustrating to have to go through those hoops when what I most wanted to do was to clear the scientific record as quickly as possible. So yeah, it was pretty awful.
Certainly. And I know a lot of people worry about these things as being career enders, something like having to retract a paper, being denied tenure, but clearly you have gone on to continue being successful. And I think this is an important lesson to share with people. It maybe leaves a little mark on your record, but doesn't necessarily ruin your career. So is this something where you've continued to face problems as a result of that, or do you feel like you've moved past it at this point?
It's something that will always be on my mind as I do science. It's that kind of thing that sticks with you for that long. I hope the kinds of changes we put in place to make sure this never happens again stick with us, right? To make the science kind of better and stronger. But if anything, given that it was an honest mistake in the sense and that we tried to do the right thing as quickly as we could, given some of the constraints of how you can report this stuff and so on, I was excited that people generally had a positive reaction to it, this idea of trying to correct the record and admit your mistakes and so on. And so I think the fact that it didn't destroy my career means that scientists really should be in position to admit this stuff and not be afraid of that. I mean, I think it's a positive testimony to the self-correction of science in lots of ways.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately science is done by people. So no matter how careful you are, there are going to be mistakes. And I think you had absolutely the right reaction, making sure that you go in there, correct it as quickly as possible, try and get everything in the right. So thank you so much for sharing this challenging time with us, Laurie. I think it's important to share these lessons with future scientists to kind of show them that, like we said, it's not the end of the road for you if one of these things happens to you. But we don't just want to talk about your dark days. So I want you to tell us next about an exciting success that meant a lot to you.
Well, I guess the most recent one was that we've just had our first paper out of our new Canine Center accepted for publication. So that feels like a really fun milestone. In lots of ways, the switch that I had from traditionally doing work on primates for as long as I had to starting to do the canine work was kind of a big transition in the middle of my career. And there definitely were some folks that looked a bit askance and were like, are you really going to switch your lab around completely? And so getting this paper finally accepted sort of felt like, aha, it wasn't a bad decision.
Yeah, you've made it.
And it's also a very cool result. It's sort of trying to look at whether or not dogs share this kind of strange human ability to get too swept up in the actions of other people, to kind kind of fall prey to other people's bad steps or other people's bad solutions. And we had thought, based on some other work, that dogs might do this. They're kind of so prone to learn from humans. Maybe they don't have such a good filter. And what we're finding is that surprisingly, dogs seem to have a better filter than even humans have for learning from other humans. So it suggests that we might have these unique quirks to be susceptible to the bad information of others.
Well, that is really cool. So I'm fascinated by this canine lab, by the way. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you started it up and what it's like working with dogs? I understand you invite people to bring their pets in as participants in your research.
Yeah. So the way it works is that people sign up their dogs online and folks can bring their companion animals in to do testing. And really what testing is it's just little fun problem solving games for dogs that they seem to enjoy a bunch. And then dogs' companions also seem to enjoy it a bunch. I think it's fun for everyone to learn more about how their dogs think, but it's also quite fun because the dog's companion gets a little like Yale diploma and we get to watch their dog have lots of cuddle time with all my Yale students. And so I think it's kind of fun all around. And our goal is really to study more about the canine mind and how it works. We're sort of particularly interested in using dogs as a model for how humans learn and whether or not humans learn from others in this unique way. And so lots of our studies have to do with how dogs learn from teaching, what they learn from human interaction, and so on.
So do you have any screening criteria that dogs have to pass? Or I know some dogs are sort of considered more intelligent or easier to train than other dogs. Do you focus on any specific types?
We're kind of an equal opportunity canine lab. I mean, our goal is to learn about dog cognition in general. And so that means we really do want dogs from all walks of life, from all breeds and all ages and so on. If we're really going to characterize the variation, we have to have some variation in our subjects. The one group of dogs that we cannot have in are dogs that have shown a history of aggression. And that's just both to protect the dogs and to protect our staff. But really, other than that, any dog is welcome to come.
Awesome. So can you think of, have there been any particularly funny or unexpected participants that you've had in or stories that you can share?
Yeah. Well, one thing is that we do get an exciting sample of dogs in for work. We, at one point, had a dog who's on the cover of the Weezer album. I don't know if you remember the old Weezer album where the dog...
Amazing.
Had celebrity dogs. And we occasionally have done some press stuff where we've had dogs come in with their companions who were themselves the news anchor or the journalist. And that's always interesting to be kind of doing press at the same time as you're kind of working with the dogs. But we have a fantastic set of companions who are willing to bring their dogs in and take time out of their lives to come help us with science. And so we're very, very lucky.
Well, that is fantastic. Laurie, congratulations on getting this canine lab set up and then also that first publication coming out. That must have been an awesome feeling.
Yes.
So can you tell us when you first got the acceptance, what'd you do?
In fact, we just found out 2 days ago.
Oh, wow. So this is hot off the press.
Yes, it's very hot off the press. My student, Angie Johnston, and Paul Holden, who are the two students I did this work with, I was, in fact, in a meeting with Angie, and as it is in science, where you get the one review and it looks like it's good, but is it going to get in? And we were saying I wonder when we're going to get our revision review back. We should hear soon. And then she left the meeting and must have checked her phone and ran back and was like, we got it while we were in the meeting. We found out. And so it was pretty exciting.
Well, that is awesome. Well, congratulations again. And I know we've talked a little bit about your life outside of science, as well as some of the research that you're doing. And as a scientist, you're always reading things, getting caught up on the literature. And it's kind of hard to find time to read non-scientific things, but I always try and carve out a little bit of book time. And I'm always looking to add things to my reading list. So Laurie, do you have a favorite book that you can recommend for me and my listeners to add to our own reading lists?
As I said before, my non-work time reading is often very cheesy autobiographies. So It's not for everybody. But if I was making a recommendation of maybe my favorite book that's a little bit more academically rigorous, maybe I would probably go with Cat's Cradle. I'm a huge Kurt Vonnegut fan. And I think being a psychologist, I'm always sort of fascinated with the quirks of life and the quirks of how we think of religion and so on. And I think Cat's Cradle is a wonderful testament to lots of the strange quirks of human psychology.
Excellent recommendation. Now, do you also have one of these cheesy autobiography type books that you can recommend for our listeners?
Oh, there's so many of them. It depends on how bad and how dirty you want to go. But for the uninitiated, Carrie Fisher autobiography is pretty fantastic. I think Wishful Drinking. For the even dirtier side, I think a good recent one is Bobby Brown's recent autobiography. She was the woman that was in the Cherry Pie video. So she's kind of a video vixen. So from the kind of slightly more intellectual to the slightly more crazy there.
Gotcha. Well, I will put all of these out on our website for our listeners to find. So can you tell us now a little bit more about travel? I know we mentioned your field research in French Polynesia recently, and I know travel is such a huge part of the life of a scientist. And I love talking about all these exotic fun places that scientists get to go. So do you have a favorite place that you've been for science, Laurie?
Well, having just gotten back from French Polynesia, that feels very salient.
Sure.
This was the UC Berkeley Gump field site that's in Moorea, which is the tiny island near Tahiti in French Polynesia. And that was pretty amazing because it's such an interesting, beautiful place. French Polynesia is very strange and it's so far from everywhere else. And so it was pretty fantastic to kind of get to travel there. But because I do work with animals, I'm lucky enough to go to all kinds of crazy places to kind of work with them, which has been very fun. I think my favorite would be the island where I do work with one of the field populations of monkeys that I work with. It's an island off the coast of Puerto Rico that's known as Cayo Santiago, and it's home to about 1,000 free-ranging rhesus monkeys. So it's this kind of strange place where the monkeys roam free, but we eat lunch in a little cage to make sure our lunch stays safe and stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's just fascinating to be in this beautiful spot in the Caribbean and to see the monkeys doing their own thing. I've been going since I was an undergraduate. So now it's actually over 20 years, which makes me feel very old. But every time I go, it feels like the best place on earth. It feels like I'm home. And I love it.
That is awesome. So can you tell us, are the monkeys pretty habituated to people being there, or do you have to kind of hunt around to find them?
They're very, very habituated. It's a small 8-hectare island, which means that if you put 1,000 monkeys on there, they're kind of monkeys all over the place. The lore down there is that they treat us like walking trees. They notice us, but don't really pay us too much mind. So they're really habituated. It's a very unique site, in part because it's been used for research for the last 70 years. So the monkeys have this long history of interacting with humans and being around them. So it's one of the rare spots where you can get so close to animals and watch their behavior in such a cool setting.
Well, that is phenomenal. Wonderful to hear about these places you've traveled. And I know you mentioned the cleaner fish that you're studying in French Polynesia. Is there something about these specific type of cleaner fish? I imagine you can find them anywhere. Why French Polynesia?
In part just because previous work had set up the site there. My colleague, Redwan Bashari, who does this work at the Gump Field Station, but also at a field station on Lizard Island, which is in Australia. And so our hope is that if our data keep coming in and things look interesting and good, that we might be able to set up another collaboration over at Lizard Island as well, which would add another cool field site spot to my bucket list, I think.
Amazing. So what are some of these remaining places on your bucket list? Are there places that you are just dying to get to that you haven't been yet?
Oh, that's interesting. We are hoping to do some cool work with a different macaque monkey species. So mostly I've studied rhesus macaque monkeys, which is kind of one kind of macaque species rather, but they vary a lot in terms of their personality. Are they like nice or despotic? Are they kind of very xenophobic, or are they kind of group loving? And one hope that we have is to add in more macaque species that have these kind of different backgrounds. And one spot where I'd really like to do this work is in Indonesia, where I've not been, where they have populations of a different macaque species where you can kind of study them a little bit more up close and personal. I think seeing a different species in a cool new setting would be a very fun thing to study.
Well, it sounds amazing. So is it easy to detect differences between these species, or are you seeing a lot of similarities in terms of how they're thinking?
Well, what we know is there's lots of differences in their behavior. So these species have been studied using more traditional primatological approaches where you watch what they do and kind of keep careful scientific track of how individuals behave. And those are how those categories have been defined in the past. But we don't yet know kind of what cognitive abilities go into them. Like, what are the different strategies they're using that lead to those different behaviors? And those are some of the things that we want to study.
Very cool. Well, Laurie, great to hear about some of the phenomenal places you've been able to travel to as a scientist, as well as some of the ones that are still on your list to hit. And I think we've talked about a lot of different people that you've encountered as a scientist, some of your students, some of these role models that you've had. And I think the people are what makes science so great in a lot of ways. And I think there are so many different types of people in science, lots of different personalities. And when you get so many bright, often quirky people in a room together, crazy things happen. So I love sharing some of these fun and funny stories of things that scientists do when they're together to highlight this human side of science. So is there a story you can share with us today, maybe a quirky tradition or a fun memory?
Well, in terms of quirky traditions, one of the ones that we've had in the lab for a long time is a sort of monkey Halloween celebration. I'm like very, very big into Halloween and always have been since I was a kid. And historically, we've always had a kind of big lab Halloween celebration. For a while, in the beginning of my career, I did some work with capuchin monkeys, and we had a big social group of capuchin monkeys here on campus. And so when we had them here, we would do this cool celebration where the lab would kind of have Halloween and carve pumpkins and do Halloween-y things, but then we would give the monkeys these strangely carved pumpkins and see how they reacted to them and kind of put some treats in there. Sort of like a little bit of enrichment for the monkeys, but also just super fun for the researchers to sort of watch this. And when the lab shifted and we kind of moved a lot more focus to the dogs here on Yale's campus, my students were like, what are we going to do with Monkey Halloween? And so we very quickly shifted it to Doggy Halloween. And we invite some of our dog participants to come with their companions in costume if they want, and to have a big Doggy Halloween celebration. And that has sort of taken the tradition in a new direction, but it's also very fun. It's awesome enough to have lots of cute dogs doing your studies, but it's even more fun to see them all dolled up in their pirate costumes and their superhero costumes for Halloween. It's a little bit of a strange tradition, but it's fun, and our lab really enjoys it.
I absolutely love this. So, Laurie, do you really get into making your own costumes?
I get into the costumes. I get into sort of throwing theme parties. I'm just a total Halloween aficionado. And so I kind of love everything about the Halloween and the candy, the spookiness, all of it.
So do you have a favorite historical Halloween costume that you've put together?
Typically, the thing I most enjoy is I also like to throw lots of Halloween theme parties, like kind of strange themes. Mm-hmm. I like doing a little bit of mashup of different Halloween themes. So we've thrown a monster luau party, sort of luau, but with monsters. We did a 80s vampire party that we called Nosferretro instead of Nosferatu.
Amazing.
We also did one that was a zombie prom. So it's kind of prom, but with zombies. So I get very into the Halloween stuff.
I love it. Well, Laurie, thank you so much for sharing one of these quirky traditions within your laboratory. And I love this idea of monkey or doggy Halloween. So are you guys pretty artsy with the pumpkin carving, or is it just kind of rough triangles and whatever you can do?
It depends on the students who are there. We sometimes print out some patterns. I think everyone tries to get very creative, draw in a dog or like a dingo or some sort of relevant animal for the things. And sometimes those are tricky and pumpkins. So it varies.
I know I am very challenged when it comes to pumpkin carving. So I usually just defer to hacking holes in it and hoping for the best. Fantastic to hear about one of these traditions in your laboratory. And I know we've talked about a lot of different aspects of your research and some of the things you do as a scientist. And I know one of the things that's really exciting about science is being able to ask big questions and then find the answers to them. So what I want to know, Laurie, today is, what is the big question in your mind that remains unanswered? And if we gave you everything, funding, staff, technology, feasibility, whatever you need, what is the question you'd want to answer?
That is a very, very hard one, I think. So many of the questions I study end up evolving out of other questions. So when you think about it, they all feel kind of very, very tiny, and they're kind of all prodding along, making their tiny discoveries as you go. I think if I was thinking at a meta level of like, what's the thing in my field that I most want to know about, it would be less about animals and more about this really fundamental question in humans about the kinds of quirks that make humans special. And these days, I've been very interested in this question of how we can get humans to recognize that we are quirkier than we realize, how to get us to recognize that we have these implicit biases that are shaping our behavior, and that our will isn't as free as the scientific data is starting to show us. I think if we knew how to do that, we'd be able to shape people's behavior a lot better. I think we'd have more honest access to some of the kinds of things that we are capable of as a species, and that we might be much better. But that involves lots of insight about human psychology, about what makes us special, about the kind of philosophy of how the mind works and how we should deal with the ethics of if we have biases that we don't realize. So it's kind of marshaling together lots of different fields, even beyond the sciences. But I think if I could answer one question or sort of come to terms with one thing, it would be that.
Well, this is very interesting. So I must ask, if you had to pick one of the most salient aspects of cognition that you're seeing that is different between humans and maybe other primates or dogs for that matter, what would it be?
One of the ones we're most interested in these days is this kind of quirk in which we don't have as much of a filter for the information that we get from other people. Obviously, we're a species that's great at learning from others. This is why we have culture. This is why we can stand on the shoulders of giants and so on. But there's more and more work suggesting that when we do that, we sometimes are so prone to take information at face value that we don't have as much of a filter on the information, that we're susceptible to other people's irrelevant solutions. Another data point is if we see someone solve something in an intentional way, it limits the amount that we explore later. So if we see somebody solve something, we don't try to look for alternative solutions that might be better. We just kind of go with what we've seen. And so we want to kind of get a sense of how do these biases work, because they seem to be the sorts of things that might allow us to do cool things like have human culture and learn from one another and so on. But they also seem to be pretty limiting in terms of our innovation. And so these are the kinds of biases that we're most excited about right now.
Gotcha. And I think all of us are familiar with these kinds of biases in your meetings at work or the daily processes that you do, like, oh, we've just always done it that way, right? So thank you so much for giving us some of these big questions to think about in our day to day. And we've kind of touched on some different points of advice in our conversation, Laurie. And I want to know, is there one piece of advice that you can really point to that was just the best advice you were ever given that you want to share with our listeners today?
Well, one that's not really related to science. I think the best advice I was given was that if you have curly hair, you should try curly hair conditioner. Don't just get the generic conditioner.
I have straight hair, so I can't relate, but
all your curly hair listeners right now are going, yeah, but no one tells you that. Sometimes you miss it, but more in a scientific domain or kind of academic domain. My colleague, Tamar Gendler, who's a philosopher here on campus and also Yale's Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, so she's a big administrator now, she's fond of seeing the sorts of bad situations in her life or the things that she found frustrating in terms of what she's learned from them, what virtues she's exercised when she's doing them. So she constantly talks about the adverse situations in her life in terms of, well, that was awful, but it taught me to practice some patience, or that was awful, but it caused me to realize that I haven't been doing X, Y, and Z, and I should be. And though she hasn't sort of used that as advice for stuff for me to do, I think I learn a lot from her example about this idea that even the stuff that you do badly can teach you about how to do it better. And that even situations that are frustrating can allow you to exercise virtue or practice things in certain ways that might be useful. So I've tried to take that on as kind of good academic advice for how to make the best of bad situations.
Definitely. And I think that finding the silver lining in every situation can be helpful for keeping you moving, keeping you from kind of falling in a rut of self-pity in a lot of cases. So awesome advice. Thank you for sharing that, Laurie. Is there any last piece of advice or a last note of inspiration that you want to end our interview on today?
To the extent that your listeners are scientists, just don't lose the curiosity and excitement that you have about the stuff that you're studying. And good luck with everything, I guess.
Awesome. Well, Laurie, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Can you tell our listeners how they can reach out or where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. If folks want, they could follow me on Twitter, where my account is just my name. So it's Laurie Santos, LaurieSantos. And if you want to check me out on the web, you could go to our website, which is doglab.yale.edu, doglab.yale.edu. Also, if you're interested not just in our science, but if you're in the New Haven area and you want to sign your dog up, we would definitely like to have as many doggy scientists as we can.
Amazing. Well, Laurie, thank you so much for sharing those resources. Definitely, listeners, follow Laurie on Twitter. Feel free to reach out, especially feel free to sign your pet up for her studies. Laurie, thank you so much for joining us today for this interview.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure. And listeners, thank you for joining us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.